Hey guys, Minaria Vibrous here. 1 second, just making sure everything's running properly. Awesome! We are live. We are good to go. Seems like I have a bit of a glare, maybe. There we go. That should fix it a little bit. But yeah, hi guys. So I'm gonna be continuing reading Timekeeper. I read the first chapter on a previous stream. I wanted to read more, but my voice was just giving out on me. So, yeah, but we're going to continue today. So, let's get into it. Chapter 2. The auto acted up as soon as Danny reached London, the frame jerking until it puttered up to the Mechanics Affairs building across from Parliament Square. It would be a miracle if he reached home before nightfall. The angry drone of men and women assaulted his ears as soon as he stepped foot outside. They blocked the entrance of the tall stone affairs building like watchdogs, an odd assortment of middle-class men with canes and working-class boys with threadbare caps, women in taffeta walking dresses and girls with coal smudges on their faces. Whenever someone walked in or out of the building, they shouted, "No support for the unnatural! Take it down! Stop construction now!" The protesters had become a regular fixture over the last couple of months, their presence just as jarring as the first time they'd gathered. Their cause had been gaining momentum lately, much to the lead mechanic's alarm. Danny supposed anyone would be nervous about the construction of a brand new clock tower. Clenching one hand into a fist, he headed for the mob. They identified him as a mechanic by the badge clipped to his belt. "Stop construction! The mechanics can't control us all! No monopolization of time!" The mob didn't reach out to grab him, didn't touch him at all, but he felt the phantom hands at his clothes, his arms, his throat. Their glaring eyes strangled him. The raised voices cut off when the doors closed behind him. Danny leaned against the nearest column and closed his eyes for a moment, willing his heart to stop beating so fast. Monopolizing time, he thought with a scoff. It was true that mechanics kept the specifics of clock towers away from the public, but it was for their own good. They wouldn't understand, not when they didn't have the ability to touch time the way mechanics did. Without the mechanics, the towers wouldn't function. Without the towers, the world wouldn't function. The very thing they protested was the thing they needed most. He shook off the thought and walked into the atrium. The wide marble floor shone, reflecting light from the crystal chandelier above. It hung suspended from a glass dome in the epicenter of the curved roof, which branched out into plaster moldings depicting the 4 seasons, one in each corner. Danny spotted a couple of mechanics leaning against the railing of the mezzanine above. Their laughter echoed across the atrium. Danny climbed the long, winding flight of stairs that led to the first-floor offices. He bypassed them as the stairs curved again, away from the atrium, toward the back of the building where the classrooms were. The hallways were long and wide, painted a shade of citrine the older mechanics insisted was once gold. He passed murals and framed paintings, classrooms full of chattering apprentices and lecturing professors, before he climbed one more flight of stairs and found himself at the lead mechanic's door. The secretary saw him and waggled her fingers toward the office. "Go in," she said. "He'll be along shortly." In the lead's office, Danny sat tapping his fingers against his knees. He told himself not to be nervous, that he was just submitting the assignment report. They were normally turned in to the secretary, but the leader had requested this particular report in person. Danny hoped he had done enough. The lead's desk was wide and cluttered. One corner was occupied by a kinetic toy that dangled 4 metal balls from cords. Danny's chair groaned as he leaned forward and lifted the ball furthest to the right and then let it fall. He watched them bounce back and forth until the door opened behind him. "Hello, Daniel." The lead was short but broad, with a dark mustache and a balding head. He looked like the sort of man who would wish you a good morning, whether you were an acquaintance or a stranger. The lead tossed a pile of papers onto his desk, glanced at the source of the clicking sound, and wrapped his hand around the metal balls to make them stop. "Was it all that bad?" the lead asked. "What do you mean, sir?" "Your face gives away everything. It always has," The man settled at his desk. Behind him stretched a wide window painted with the colors of approaching dusk. Tell me what happened. Danny gave a verbal report as he handed over the written one. It had come out only one page, hastily scrawled on a crumpled piece on crumpled parchment he'd found at the bottom of his bag. He hadn't had time to find real paper. He was much too anxious to find out what the lead had to say. The lead skimmed the report with a critical eye, then set it down. It sounds as if everything went well. Danny wondered if he had caught a hint of surprise beneath the words. I suppose it did. Don't be modest, Daniel. This was a medium-risk assignment, and you pulled it off. That's something to be proud of. He smiled, and Danny started to smile too. Before, he had never questioned praise. Now it sat tepid and uncertain at the bottom of his ribcage, afraid to rise too high lest it pop like a bubble under atmospheric pressure. I was afraid it would be too much for you, the lead continued. This is certainly a successful first step. The bubble popped, and Danny's smile vanished. He resisted the urge to slip down from his seat. First step. He'd made so many steps since becoming a mechanic, followed by several large steps back. Now he was lost somewhere in the middle. Still, he forced himself to reply with a small, Thank you, sir. The lead read through the report again. Was the apprentice agreeable? It was known throughout the ranks that Danny Hart never got along with his apprentices. Several were on a list of those never to be reassigned to him again due to backtalk, piss-poor attitudes, or in one case, body odor. Danny regretted yelling at Brandon. He hadn't deserved it. Not really. Even if he was a Dow cop who didn't know what a micrometer was. No, Danny said, but too quiet if you ask me. The lead rested his arm on the desk and leaned forward. You look peaky. And there it was. He couldn't avoid it. As soon as word had spread that he'd been hospitalized, people had started looking at him differently, talking to him differently. Quiet, cautious, like he would crumble to dust at the slightest provocation. I don't know. Bleh. I'm fine, sir, Danny said, although it wasn't the assignment I expected. Don't dip your toe in the water to get used to it. Jump in head first. Danny had some things to say about that, but wisely kept them behind sealed lips. Now, about the missing numeral, the lead went on. I've heard nothing from the investigation crew. Did you happen to see anything suspicious while you were there? Anyone lingering near the tower or avoiding it? I couldn't tell with the crowd. I got a good look at the clock face, but I didn't see any marks or scratches. The police were still investigating when he'd left, though. They wouldn't stop until a suspect was found. The lead chewed his mustache. The only way the numeral could have detached so cleanly is if a mechanic committed the theft. I suppose the numeral could have dropped from the tower and someone picked it up, but all the same, we should be careful. We don't want clock parts popping up on the black market if they haven't already. He sighed and drummed his fingers against the desktop. First Malden, then your accident, now this. A beat of his heart, and an intake of breath. Danny scooted forward. Sir, has there been any news about Malden? About the new clock tower? The lead rolled his shoulders back and cleared his throat. I'm sorry, Daniel. Not yet. It's a bit tricky, you know. This is the first tower we've attempted to build in hundreds of years, and what with the protesters, it's making it even harder. You must be patient. But what about the mechanics working on the tower? What I mean is, because of what I did today, he clasped his hands between his knees as the lead gave him that familiar look of sympathy. I know you want to go, Daniel. It's a big job, and... Slow down on the Liverpool. This isn't Liverpool. This is just my reading speed, dude. He clasped his hands between his knees as the lead gave him that familiar look of sympathy. I know you want to go, Daniel. It's a big job, and there are several things I need to take into account. You did well in Enfield, and I'm happy to see you haven't lost your spark. But this is something altogether different. We'll see. He was stalling. The decision should have been simple. What wasn't said was plastered all over the walls. Danny had to overcome his fears before the lead would let him near such an important assignment. Based on his behavior today, Danny's hope dwindled even further. He grabbed his bag to leave when the lead stopped him. "I just wanted to remind you," he said slowly, each word like a step toward a cliff, "not to give up hope about Malden or your father." Danny couldn't look him in the eye, so he turned to the door and swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Daniel?" He turned back. "I know you have your heart set on this. Just give it some time. I'm still considering you for the job. Don't worry." "Thank you, sir." Danny took his time on the stairs and hesitated at the doors. Holding his breath, he rushed outside. But at this late hour, the protesters had thinned. Even so, he hurried down the street to where he'd parked his auto. The rain had stopped long enough for the clouds to part. Sunset made the sky blush and set low-hanging clouds on fire. Danny took a moment to breathe in the autumn air and spotted a dirigible airship passing overhead, leaving a contrail of steam in its wake. He watched the ship until it passed above the massive clock tower across the square. At one end of Parliament stood the tower some called St. Stephen's, others called Big Ben. The feud about the tower's real name was well known, especially among the mechanics who worked there on a regular basis. Ben, of course, was the name of the enormous bell within, but Danny preferred it over the stuffy-sounding St. Stephen's. Much of his training had taken place within that very tower, where the smell of oil and the whir of automation had become as natural as drawing breath. He had once noticed a man standing at the back of the class, taller than the others, with a dark blonde beard. The man had caught Danny staring and winked. While the others debated, 14-year-old Danny had quietly stepped aside and asked him which name he preferred. The mechanic had thought about it, listened to the clockwork for a while, and smiled down at him. "Big Ben. It has more presence." 17-year-old Danny now slid into the driver's seat, willing the auto to start. It did, although an ominous ribbon of dark smoke coiled through the engine's white steam. He pulled out and drove by the Gothic Cathedral of Westminster Abbey, passing each scowling gargoyle. A couple of mechanical gargoyles prowled the upper lip of the roof, guardians made of gears and springs rather than stone. He passed the clock tower to Westminster Bridge, congested with autos that released a heavy fog of steam. Whenever he was close enough, he could sense Big Ben's natural energy, the fibers of time ingrained in every living thing around it. It felt bright, powerful. It felt like life. One moment of time could be enjoyed before it drifted into another and another, until it became the future, present, and finally the past. It was the sole reason London thrived. If anything irreversible were to happen to that tower, or to any clock tower for that matter, time in that city and its surroundings would simply stop, its inhabitants trapped until the clock was fixed. It was no wonder the protesters hated them. Sometimes Danny hated the clock towers too. He drove through Lambeth and reached home just after dark. The street was draped in shadow, relieved only by the soft glow from the row of house windows, including his own. That meant his mother was home. She tended to work late hours now, something she would never have done when he was younger, when his father was still around. The last few meters were the toughest for the auto, but it made it all the way to the curb before sputtering to a halt. Smoke billowed from the bonnet, like ghostly visitors had hitched a ride, and this was their stop. Danny unlocked the front door and threw his things on the floor. The house stood tall and narrow, with a treacherously steep flight of stairs leading to the bedrooms above. Green wallpaper ran from ceiling to floor, a color long since faded from emerald to celadon. The kitchen on the right was separated from the hall by a push-through door that tended to stick. He had to shoulder his way inside. His mother sat at the kitchen table reading a newspaper in the dim glow of a lantern. The light caught her mane of curly brown hair, unmanageable even in the best of weather. She held a half-burnt cigarette between two fingers, yellowed by years of addiction. "Hello, darling," she said. "How was it?" Danny answered with a shrug and walked by a pile of dirty dishes to check the pantry. His mother drew his attention to the sausage roll on the table. He tore into it at once. "Thought you'd be out later than this," Lila said, resting a pointed chin on one hand as she blew smoke from her slightly puckered mouth. His father had often joked that she'd sucked too hard on a lemon. She had sucked too hard on a lemon as a child. Thought so too. What with the rubbish auto I've got? Lila's eyes flashed. They were dark brown and lined with crow's feet. Danny was more an image of his father, from his green eyes to his gangly limbs. You best be taking good care of it. It's not me making it break down, it's the bloody engine. He wanted a new auto, and was secretly saving his money, but his mother refused to be rid of this one. His father had worked hard to afford it, and it was a miracle they had one at all. Families like theirs, in the lowest rung of the middle-class ladder, usually couldn't boast such a luxury. I'll have Cassie take a look tomorrow. Lila dropped her eyes to the paper spread out before her on the table. He spied a report on recent events in India. Besides that were job adverts. Nothing about towers. Mum, Danny said carefully, the lead told me there's no news about Malden. Lila paused, then took another drag from her cigarette. She let out a smoky sigh. Just as easily as Danny could sense the fibers of time, so too could he sense the strain between them. He never understood what his mother needed, especially now, when they were two boats drifting into separate currents. Danny could fix clocks, but he didn't know if he could fix this. Not on his own. He inhaled as if to speak, but remained silent. Eventually, Lila lifted her head. I'm off to bed. Douse the light, will you? He flattened the rest of the roll between his fingers, leaving imprints in the thick dough. Mum, don't work so hard. The job today was worth at least £5. Lila paused again as she stood up, one hand resting on the tabletop, as she studied her son across the seemingly immeasurable distance. It's all right, Danny, she said. Don't worry about me. He listened to the clack of her high-heeled boots on the stairs and the muffled closing of her bedroom door. Sighing, he stuffed the last of the thick bread in his mouth and turned to the pile of dirty dishes. His jittery hands scrubbed and soaked until he found some minor relief in the chore. His mind filled only with the suds, one less thing for his mother to worry about. He stared at the empty counter for a few minutes, then doused the lamp. The clock tower hummed all around him. His hands were on the clockwork, admiring the design of the cogs, the punctuality of it all. Every second tripped onward, one after the other, each tick a breath of air. It filled his lungs, his chest, seeped through muscle and bone until it fused with the beating core of him. He was connected to time. It was the greatest feeling in the world. But something was wrong. A shift in the air, a crook of misfortune's finger. As he reached for the nearest gear, it exploded outward, cutting his hand. He scrambled backward, but not before the rest of the clockwork blasted from the wall. All the metal, the smoke, and splinters rushing at him like a tidal wave. He was smothered in gray. He choked on blood. Copper filled his mouth, chipped his teeth, and gouged his eyes, searing his skin. A gash on his chin seeped crimson onto his white shirt. He couldn't hold it in, couldn't stop it. He couldn't reach for time any longer. It danced out of his grasp. Wild, unobtainable. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't. Danny's scream cut off when he hit the floor. Struggling, he realized he was tangled in the sheets. His bedroom was dark, as he always did when the nightmare came. He fumbled for his timepiece, the one his father had given him when he was an apprentice. His hand shook so badly that he dropped it twice, but when it opened, he made himself stare at the hands going around the clock face. Tick, tock. Time hadn't stopped. I was in an accident. I got out. I'm safe now. He touched the scar on his chin, counted the spaces where the stitches had been. There was another scar on his chest, and one on his right thigh, but this one bothered him most. This was his daily reminder, the one the world could see. It had been 3 months. 3 months since he had been assigned to a small, out-of-the-way clock in Shire, a village outside of London. It should have been easy, quick, uncomplicated. As he worked on the clockwork for a much-needed cleaning, the mechanism had exploded. For one hair-raising moment, the village had stopped. He didn't know how he'd walked away from that place. The lead said only Only Danny's quick work had prevented Sheer from being stopped for good. Acting as if someone else controlled him, Danny had reattached the cogs and wound the clock, desperately nudging time to start again. And it had. But something else had happened that day. The world itself had trembled. An unfamiliar energy had overtaken him, flooding the tower. He couldn't explain it, but he was sure it had played a part in starting time again. He crawled back into bed and wrapped the blanket around himself. He listened to see if his mother would come, if she'd heard the screaming, but there was no sound on the other side of the wall. Closing his eyes, he clutched the timepiece to his chest, where it ticked above his rapidly beating heart. The next morning, Danny woke to the shrill ring of the telephone. "Hello?" he croaked into the mouthpiece, rubbing gritty sleep from his eyes while holding the receiver to his ear. "Daniel? Sorry to call so early, but it's important." The voice belonged to the lead mechanic, and he sounded worried. Danny was instantly more awake. "What is it, sir?" "Someone's discovered the missing Enfield numeral." Okay, drink water. While we're between chapters. Okay. Chapter 3. The man from Enfield stood clutching his felt cap in a white-knuckled grip. He fiddled with it as the lead read the report, turning it over and over in his calloused laborer's hands. Danny watched until he was dizzy. They were in the lead mechanic's office, the lead seated behind his desk, and Danny standing to one side. A beam of sunlight struggled to escape the clouds and shine through the window at their backs. It gleamed on the goggles that hung around the man's thick neck. "Tell us again how you heard about the tower," the lead said. The man swallowed, and his Adam's apple bobbed. "I heard... Oh my gosh. No. I heard only that the tower was broke, and that the two was missing. Couldn't tell you how. We all went to take a peek. I was one of the first since I wake sooner than most." He hesitated. "Go on," the lead said. I'm sorry about bad accents. I don't have the right accent for reading this. So yeah, great. The man scratched his scalp. From his greasy brown hair to the coal dust on his cheek, he looked like he hadn't seen the right side of the bathtub in weeks. "I walked over, saw the tower, and thought it didn't look right. Others were muttering the same. When I turned to walk back, I had my eyes on the ground, and down the street I saw this." Yeah, thanks. So literally the writing in the book doesn't have the H's. For example, if I just type it out, it just says this. So I'm just guessing on how it's supposed to sound. Because I don't know. That's not something you hear over here in America. That's not an accent you hear over here. So, yeah. He crammed the felt cap in his pocket and lifted a large rectangular slab of black metal with a small, barely perceivable slit in the middle. The edges were soft and distorted, like it had been in the process of being melted down. Danny, in the lead, inhaled sharply, a tug of something familiar from the metal, like time fibers around the clock towers. The air around Danny shivered, and the hairs on his arms stood on end. "What have you done to it?" he demanded. "I didn't do nothing. I'm an iron worker, and I look for pieces like this to use in the workshop. When I walked back to the shop, I saw this on the ground, all mingled up and melted. Couldn't think of what had done it, and I couldn't know it was from the tower, could I?" The lead rubbed his forehead. Only mechanics would be able to feel the properties of the clock's power in that numeral. The ironworker's shoulders sagged in relief. The London dealers were going about asking questions, so when they came to the door, I showed them the block readily enough, and they led me here. I'm terribly sorry if it's made a mess. I can't do this. The lead glanced at Danny. "The issue is fixed now, at any rate." "Are you sure you found the numeral as you're holding it? You didn't alter it in any way?" "No time to." the ironworker said. I had another project to get on with, and the police showed up in the middle. Probably need to start that over now. I apologize for that, but I'm sure you'll agree your town's well-being is of slightly more importance. Oh well, yes, of course it is, sir. The lead sighed. Very well. Please leave that on my desk and follow your escort out. Once the ironworker left in the company of the policemen who had been waiting outside, Danny turned to the lead. He has to know something. Yeah, I also, in my defense, I live in America, so I don't have any kind of accent like this. Like my accent, my vocal cords don't easily fit into this, in my defense. So he doesn't, Daniel. There was even a witness who saw him find the numeral down the street from the tower. His story seems to sound, although I'm sure he must have realized it was a numeral at some point. His story seems sound. If it can be called one, Danny picked up the lump of metal, wincing. It felt wrong, warped. If it wasn't the ironworker, then what happened? What could have done this to a piece of time? The lead frowned at the ruined numeral, then shook his head. Perhaps time itself will tell. Yeah, okay. Blazes, what did you do? Feed it chin? Danny crossed his arms and glared at the auto bonnet, which his friend Cassie had peeled open to reveal the steam engine underneath. The boiler was rusting in places, forming patches of brownish orange like deceased flowers. With months away from work, he didn't have the funds to replace it yet. The pressure's off, Cassie muttered to herself as she knelt before the boiler. Her frizzy auburn hair was tied back, and it gleamed in the watery sunshine. Have you been forcing it to go on low temp? I don't drive it cold, he said. It's old, that's all. My father bought it years ago. It's one of the very first models. Cassie hummed in reply and leaned forward to tamper with something on the inside of the boiler, one hand absently twirling a wrench as she worked. He had no idea how she knew all of this. For her, it was like reciting the alphabet. He preferred the familiarity of a clock, the mechanics of which made Cassie cross-eyed. She turned those blue eyes on him, a smudge of dirt on her freckled nose. Have you thought about installing a condenser? A what? He used his sleeve to wipe away the dirt, and she wrinkled her nose at him. They've just patented it, and it saves you the trouble of the feed water. It's a lot more weight for the auto to take on, but it's useful. How much does it cost? She shrugged. 20 quid. 20 pounds? I'll take my chances. I don't know how much that is. Oh, God. One of my other main problems with reading this book in general is that when they talk about, like, the currencies, I don't understand it. So, like, yeah, that's great. Her face fell a little. A condenser would be safer. Or even a new model. This old thing won't be around much longer. She patted the door as she would a dog. Don't talk about it that way. What, you're allowed to whine about it and I'm not? Her tone had been joking, but seeing his face, Cassie stood and wrapped an arm around his waist. Calm down, Dan. It's just an auto. You know it isn't. He slipped away from her and leaned against the auto door as Cassie leaned on the fence. Okay, so $27 in the 1800s. Yeah, that's pretty... Okay, fair enough. Fair enough that he's complaining about that. Cassie leaned on the fence surrounding the heart's dying front garden. Danny had thought about maintaining the garden during his time off, but one spider bite had driven him away from it forever. Yeah, I guess 20 pounds in the 1800s would be quite a bit for something like that, but also it's for a car or auto. So, yeah. What's happened then? Cassie asked. The neighbor's tabby slinked around the corner and rubbed itself against Danny's leg. Wanting to avoid Cassie's eyes, he bent down and scratched behind the cat's ears, burying his fingers in its soft fur. You and your mom had a row? Cassie guessed. Not quite, unless you considered it 3 years of resentment a row. Lila had grown distant after what happened to his father, so wrapped up in her loss that she didn't have the capacity to comfort him and his. Now they could barely last 2 minutes together. He never told Cassie the reason why. It sat like an unmovable stone in the pit of his stomach. If he tried to pull it free, if he even brushed against its sharp edges, he would be cut open, and his shame would pour out. The cat took off in pursuit of a pigeon down the road. Danny stood and decided he couldn't touch that stone. Not yet. He turned to another problem instead, one Cassie already knew. Things have just been odd ever since I told her. He trailed off, and Cassie nodded. It made him uncomfortable to say it out loud. But Cassie, his friend since childhood, never needed words to understand him. A few months ago, before the disastrous job that had given him his scar and his nightmares, Danny had finally announced what he had known since he was 11, that he preferred boys over girls. It used to be a capital offense, punishable by hanging or worse, but that law had been abolished in the last decade. While the rural parts of England were still offended by the notion, more civilized areas such as London accepted it with barely a good heavens. But much like the protesters condemning the clock towers, that didn't prevent some from thinking it was unnatural. He supposed he should feel lucky. The ghosts of those before him, the ones who hadn't been so lucky, were a constant weight reminding him he had to make the most of this new freedom. He told others the truth, his heart knocking against his chest and his breath like daggers in his lungs each time. The reactions ranged from wide-eyed ohs to sage nods, as if they had known all along. Most people, like Cassie, treated him the same. His mother hadn't reacted at all. She'd merely sat at the kitchen table and stared at a point over Danny's shoulder, as though she couldn't bear to look at him directly. The space between them had grown tight and still. It was like the hollow ache of air devoid of words, a breathless subtraction. He'd swallowed that air until pockets of silence sat cancerous in his bones, threatening to expand, to crack. He knew she kept her distance for another reason, the stone that Danny could not touch. This new information was only another cog in their complicated clockwork. Cassie gently kicked his boot. Don't worry, she'll get used to it. She'll have to, or else what'll she say when you bring home a handsome young man? Shove off. Not quite what I had in mind. She laughed and noisily kissed his cheek. Now then, about this boiler. You got £2 on you? He dug in his pockets for the money. There's a good lad. Oh, you haven't said if there's been any news. News? You know, about the assignment. Danny thought back to the heaviness in the lead's eyes, the pity he was tired of seeing. His stomach dropped. He wanted the assignment so badly it hurt. The lead says there's been no progress. He won't make the decision yet. I'm sorry, Dan. I know how much it means to you. It'll probably take time, though, won't it? Building a brand new clock tower? Not just that. The first clock tower to be built in hundreds of years. The time zones of every city were firmly locked in place by towers, which had been built to regulate time more efficiently. Sure, I can pause. Why? Okay. Just let me know when you get back, I guess. I could use a water break anyway. My throat kind of hurts. Hey, you're the only one watching right now, so... Okay. So, the time zones of every city were firmly locked in place by the towers, which had been built to regulate time more efficiently. But the builders had destroyed all knowledge of how to create them. The idea of a new tower had first been met with scorn, but the lead was determined to see it through. No one knows how to build them anymore, Danny said. Just how to repair them. He dropped his voice to a bitter murmur. Fat lot of good that does us now. If we don't get this tower to work, we'll never see Dad again. Cassie watched him somberly. The stone inside him ached, begging to be pried free. Cassie knew what it was like to live with guilt. Danny saw it in the way she kept glancing at the auto beside them, her fingers twitching to double-check the engine. But he remained silent, and Cassie wrapped a hand around his arm. It'll all work out. At least you did good with the Enfield job, yeah? He nodded. Then that's something. They'll see you're back in the game. Do you think you'll go there again? To Enfield? He remembered the fear that had choked him, the sense of dread he'd felt just from looking at the clockwork. Maybe the lead was right to keep him away from the new Malden Tower. Not if I can help it, he said. Fate must have taken a dislike to Danny, because he was called into the lead's office a couple of days later. Colton Tower? Danny said. But I was just there. The lead raised his hands, just as confused. The little amount of hair he still possessed stuck out awkwardly, as if he'd run his hands through it several times. The maintenance crews phoned in with another problem. Danny's heart gave an extra hard thump. Which is the minute hand's gone missing. Fate didn't dislike Danny. Fate despised him. He took a moment to rub a hand over his face, hoping that when he was done, the world would be a little less upsetting. Well, the minute hand's not exactly missing, the lead said. They found it at the bottom of the tower, bent at a right angle. Danny choked on his own saliva. Bent? But what's happened to the town? He asked, not bothering to conceal the worry in his voice. They're fine, so far as we know, but it's interfering with daily life. Time is moving in quick bursts, once an hour. Mayor Aldridge said it's like tripping. In any case, we've commissioned a new hand to be made. As soon as it's installed, it'll fuse with the power of the clock tower, and time should go back to normal. The hand will be ready for pickup soon. Do you think you can handle this, Daniel? Despite his instinct to say no, Danny told the lead that he was more than willing. It wasn't entirely a lie. He wanted to make sure the tower was all right. Maybe he could learn something more about the vandalism. Maybe, if he figured out what was going on, he could finally convince the lead to put him on the assignment. As he was leaving, he hesitated on the second floor and turned away from the stairs. Toward I should have looked up how to say this name. Matthias's classroom. Matthias, I don't know. Matthias was an old friend of his father's. He and Christopher Hart had started off as apprentice mechanics together, and it hadn't taken much time for them to grow inseparable. From shared assignments to orchestrating pranks on the other apprentices, they had done everything together. As a result, Matthias had been a big part of Danny's life as well, a regular figure at Sunday dinners and birthday parties. What Danny remembered most was Matthias looking after him when his parents went out. The man would feed him stories as the night grew long, stories of his travels, some true, some nothing more than fancy. Did I tell you about the time I met a witch in... Oh my gosh, no. Bio Louisa Forest. She said she would put a curse on me if I hurt any of her bison. And when Danny was lonely or scared, Matthias would drape a strong arm over his shoulders, keeping him safe and close. Danny needed to feel a measure of that safety right now. Matthias was teaching a room of apprentices when Danny found him. He told me what? Okay, to be fair, it's also spelled weird. Or maybe I'm just not used to it. But that's the name that I'm dealing with. And then there's... I-E-T-A. So there's Matthias and Bialoisa, or however the hell that's pronounced. Matthias was a tall man with a wide chest and a strong jaw, and he normally braided his brown hair, which would have been a source of humor for the younger mechanics if it weren't for his reputation for winning pub brawls. I'll just stick with calling him his full name. Just I know it's harder on me, but I can just look up the name later. If I'm wrong, I'll fix it next stream because I doubt I'm gonna get through all of this in one stream. Unless I really hate my voice that freaking much. But even though Matthias could be strong and bold, what Danny liked most about him was his calm, easy manner, so at odds with his own. Even now, Danny saw the room of teenagers barely younger than himself and hung back. Yay, I'm saying it right now. Okay. It's not a name you see in America. Like, it's not a name you ever hear over here. So, when the pieces of the clockwork are removed, you must be careful to wrap them up and store them, or else they might go missing. It's a Polish name. No way I could have known that, because again, it's not a name from my area, from my country. So, Matthias stood before a sketch of clockwork drawn across the chalkboard, pointing sternly to a cog drawn to one side. A metallic wording box on the teacher's desk recorded every word of the lecture, inscribing them with a tin wheel. The bits of clockwork are still powerful, even when they've been removed from the main frame, so these need to be taken back to the office. Never toss pieces away. You get that, you lot? He was chorused with yeses and nods. Danny smiled. He had never been in Matthias' class as an apprentice, but wished he had been. Now then, one last thing before I let you loose. We have a special visitor today who's going to tell you a little more about how assignments work. Matthias nodded to a corner Danny couldn't see. A tall blonde girl walked up to the front of the classroom. Her broad shoulders held straight and her gait steadfast. When he recognized her, Danny held back a curse. Daphne Richards, a full mechanic only a year older than himself. She and that snob, Lucas Wakefield, had been the youngest mechanics on record at 18 before Danny had snatched the title away, putting a target on his back at the same time. Since then, the three had used their strengths to demand the most challenging assignments in an effort to outdo one another. Daphne with her intellect, Lucas with his looks and his money, and Danny with his sheer, if sometimes aggressive, determination. It had driven the lead mad. Then Danny's accident had happened. A twinge of jealousy ran through him. Why hadn't Matthias asked him to speak to his class? Then again, Matthias had been Daphne's mentor, just as Danny's father had taken upon himself to teach Danny all he knew. Matthias had chosen Daphne as his junior apprentice. That sort of bond was hard to sever. Daphne gave Matthias a small smile and turned to the class. Like some of the younger women in London, she chose to wear trousers and a blouse. Her dark jacket helped conceal her curves, but it couldn't hide the purple diamond-shaped tattoo beside her right eye. He'd once heard an older mechanic call her a walking scandal. As many of you know, she began, London is the central headquarters for clock mechanic affairs in England. When you've passed your assessments to become full mechanics, you'll have the option of staying here and receiving assignments for towns in and around Greater London, including Essex and Kent. Or, if you prefer, you may relocate to another of the branches, such as Manchester. We're also developing a foreign exchange program with the clock mechanic unions in China and America. The latter, for example, would allow certain apprentices to visit one of the American Union hubs, such as the one in New York. As she discussed the exchange program, Danny scanned the room. The boys weren't paying attention to her. They were either scribbling in their notebooks or staring out the windows. The girls, however, were enraptured. One girl was furiously writing down everything Daphne said, getting ink splotches all over her hands. We're also in the process of beginning an exchange program with India, Daphne went on, and Danny's attention snapped back to her. Indian apprentices can come to London to learn, and London apprentices can go to Delhi or one of the other large cities to study Indian tower design. Danny watched her face as she continued to discuss plans for the new program. He was one of the few mechanics who knew, that her father had been half Indian. No one would guess it, looking at her skin and her hair and her eyes. Danny certainly wouldn't have known if Matthias hadn't accidentally let it slip years ago. There are many who oppose the idea of a female clock mechanic at all, let alone one with foreign blood. Despite their history, Danny couldn't help but feel an unspoken understanding. There were some things you were better off keeping to yourself, if you could. Daphne finished her speech just as a steam whistle blew, signaling the end of class. The apprentices rose with a rustle of papers and the scraping of chair legs, while Matthias thanked Daphne for her time. As she headed out the door, her pale blue eyes locked onto Danny's. "Mr. Hart," she said coolly. "Miss Richards." When she and the students had all gone, Danny slipped inside the classroom. Matthias flipped a switch on the recording mechanism to power it down. "Danny boy," Matthias grinned. "How was your assignment?" "We heard about the missing numeral." Danny rubbed the back of his neck. "Could have been worse. How are you, Matthias?" "Could be worse," he echoed. "What happened?" Danny told him about the melted numeral and how it had been found. Matthias whistled. "And it just happened to be found by a man who melts iron for a living. It's fishy, isn't it?" Danny sat on top of a wooden desk in the front row. "Now there's a report that the minute hand's been bent. I think it's the ironworker, but the lead doesn't suspect him." If the lead doesn't suspect him, I doubt there's anything you can do. Just complete the assignment as best you can." Not quite the answer Danny wanted. If it hadn't been the ironworker, then who could have stolen the numeral? He thought about the protesters outside, and his shoulders tightened. He thought also about the mechanics who had been at the sheer tower before him, who would have had plenty of time to hide a bomb within the clockwork. Someone had carved the initials EB into the desk on which he sat. He traced the letters with his fingertip, trying not to think about his scar, where the clock had carved its own initials into his skin. Matthias noticed the shift in Danny's mood. "Was the assignment hard for you, after what happened?" "It wasn't hard at all," he lied. "It's my job." "Danny," he said. He sighed. "Yes, it was hard. Would you be surprised if it wasn't?" "I don't blame you for being scared." Matthias sat on the professor's desk facing him. "It's only been a few months since the accident. Your mother says you're still having nightmares." Of course his mother would hear him screaming at night. Not like she would bother asking him about it in the morning. Matthias frowned. "We're worried, Danny. Look at me. I'm fine." Matthias studied him for a moment, then stood up and walked to Danny with his little finger extended. "You'll swear on it?" It was a custom Matthias had learned in China when he'd visited as a much younger man. He had taught Danny, too. He had taught it to Danny a long time ago. "Matthias," he groaned, "I'm too old for that sort of thing." "You're never too old to tell the truth." Danny rolled his eyes, held up his own little finger to entwine it with the man's thicker one. They shook. Matthias lightly cuffed his head. "You should be off. You have menacing ironworkers to question and clocks to save." Danny noted the rings of exhaustion under Matthias' eyes. The man had a scare when he had heard of Danny's accident. Matthias didn't have many people in his life to fuss over, which meant Danny got the brunt of his protectiveness. But maybe he had looked tired for another reason. Danny wondered if the apprentices had been talking about Matthias behind his back again. "Go on," Matthias urged, with a shooing motion. Danny slipped off the desk and wondered if there would ever come a time when adults stopped treating him like a fragile object. He needed to go downstairs and wait for the new minute hand. Trying to distract himself from wondering what the protesters would do if they saw the part in his arms. Danny walked down the hall and glanced at the paintings as he went. He slowed to a stop when he came to the one he knew best, his father's favorite. It depicted a storm-tossed sea in grays and blues and greens. The water parted to reveal a dark ocean floor. In that waterless cavity stood two large figures, one red and one gold. They faced each other, prepared for a difficult fight. Lightning forked above their heads. Danny touched his fingers to the golden figure and thought of the golden tower in Enfield. The more he focused on it, the heavier his body grew. What if these incidents meant more? What if they were a prelude to something else? Away from Matthias' calming presence, Danny's stomach twisted into knots again. Sometimes clocks fell apart with age. It was to be expected when the towers had been maintaining time for hundreds of years. But this was not the same thing. A numeral had been melted. A hand had been bent. What was strong enough to tamper with time? Okay. Another quick water break. Okay. Chapter 4. Danny's mother and Matthias had told him stories when he was younger, but his father kept a few up his sleeve as well. Thanks. The first time Danny remembered seeing Big Ben, really seeing it and feeling it for what it was, he'd asked his father how the clocks ran in the first place. "Don't you know?" Christopher had asked, feigning shock. "How on earth will you be a clock mechanic if you don't know your origins, Ticker?" Every story originated from myth. Different cultures had their own gods. Their world had both. Kronos was the father of time. After the world was shaped, he woke within the cosmos, wrapped within galaxies and energy. He saw the earth and how wild and untamed it had become, how it needed to be maintained. So he created time out of the restless power within him, a tiny stream that became a raging flood as it spun the earth on its axis. Men and women aged. Trees grew, plants withered. Time moved all things, killed all things. But Kronos couldn't keep an eye on everything, so he cut 4 fingers from his hand. From his fingers grew the Gaian gods. Each one chose to oversee an element. Terra, earth. Calem, sky. Oceana, sea. Ateus, time. I'm assuming I'm saying Ateus right? I have no idea. Ateus was called the Timekeeper, his father had said, one hand resting on Danny's shoulder. He remembered the familiar weight of it, the strength of those fingers gently squeezing his shoulder, the calluses on his father's palm. He made sure the pattern of time never became unbalanced, never got too tangled. He made sure our pasts, presents, and futures never collided. While the Gaian gods maintained the earth's elements and humanity advanced, Kronos grew hateful. He saw lives of greed, lives of gluttony, lives of pride and blood and sin. Weary of this corrupt world, he retreated into slumber. Yay, I'm glad I'm saying it right. It's a weird spelling, to be fair. So, like, for people who don't know. It's weird, so yeah, there. Ateus also grew weary and mad with the power of time, which was too enormous for him to bear alone. His sister, Oceana, begged him to return to his domain, to Kronos. When he tried, Kronos turned him away and told him to forget the burden. The world could burn. He no longer cared. But Ateus cared. Desperate, he gifted some of his power to humans so that they might help him control the wild beast that was time. Yay, thanks. Kronos found out, and oof, was he mad. I'm sorry, but I don't think people said oof back then, but hey, maybe I'm wrong. Christopher smacked the side of his leg for emphasis. Okay, I'm legit not joking. Like if I can get it to, it literally just says oof right here. Like legit. That's what the book says. Yeah. Pretty sure people did say oof. Okay. Kronos found out, and oof was he mad. Christopher smacked the side of his leg for emphasis. He woke and confronted Ateus, said that humans should not be given such power. Yeah, it was created like late 2010. Like it's not something you would hear in the 1800s. But hey, it exists still. Apparently. Okay. Kronos descended to where Ateus lived, within the ocean. The water parted for their battle, roiling walls of gray and blue, the crash of lightning and waves above. They fought among dry coral reefs and seashells that broke beneath their feet. The sea a raging storm for 3 days and 3 nights, until Ateus grew weak enough for Kronos to land the final blow. Danny had looked up, his eyes wide. Kronos killed Ateus. Yes, but when he did, time shattered. No one could control it, and so we built the towers. Christopher had gestured to Big Ben. The towers are conductors of Ateus' leftover power. Through them, we can control time, or give ourselves the illusion we can. The burden is ours now. We are the Timekeepers. There were no gang gods to help anymore, and the other 3 had receded, choosing to fade to little more than myth. The demand for technology grew in their absence, a demand for humans to control what was once out of their grasp. People held fast to their Bibles and their churches, to the belief that perhaps a benevolent creator looked on and did nothing. Everyone leaves in the end. It took an hour to reach Enfield. As he got closer, Danny hit a bump in the road and swerved to avoid it. He cursed as his heart jumped into his throat. This bloody town would kill him. The town was holding its weekly market, and people were clogging the path. He parked on the outskirts and lifted the thin, long parcel containing the new minute hand from the back of the auto. Immediately he sensed the cracks in time, the empty pockets of missing seconds and moments. It made the air heavy and the sky appear frozen, as if the town were being forced to slow down until the next hour. Time wanted to move in leaps, just as the lead had said. Why on earth were they holding the market now? He peered at their faces and noticed tight mouths, narrowed eyes. They were putting up a brave front. Danny walked across the village green and caught glimpses of the wares for sale. Timepieces, crockery, flower pulp paper, even a large clunky photograph taker. The urge to just say photographer. Anyway, the black camera box sat on its 3-legged stand like a raven perched on a fence. Danny longed to have one of his own to play with. The lightness of his pockets kept him away. He examined the timepieces for sale. They hadn't stopped exactly, but the minute hands were stuck at 11, the time when the minute hand had been detached from the tower. At least the hour hands were all correct. How do you know what time it is? He asked a woman passing by. We guess, was her terse answer. Fair enough. Someone touched Danny's shoulder and he turned, coming face to face with Mayor Aldridge. The mayor's mouth was creased from a lifetime of frowning. Mr. Hart, thank you for coming back so soon. I'm sorry for the trouble. That's all right. I brought a new minute hand. Brilliant. Aldridge was distantly glancing at the parcel under his arm. The sooner we return to normal, the better. We've tried to keep things as routine as possible, setting up the market and all. Don't want them to think too much about becoming another Malden. The mayor mustered up a nervous laugh and Day's cheek twitched. The The police will be here again, won't they? The lead had mentioned that there would be an investigation, and Danny said as much to the mayor. Aldridge sighed. Nothing for it, then. Such a disturbance. Danny nodded in a vaguely sympathetic way and excused himself. He walked past the church to the tower beyond the green, eyes on the missing pivotal line of the minute hand. Walking through the town was like walking through a bog. Time dragged him down, willing him to stop where he stood until the next hour rang. He gritted his teeth and pressed on. The tower sent a hollow ache through his chest. When he crossed the threshold, Danny grunted and braced himself against the wall, wondering if this was how it felt to lose a limb. He climbed the stairs, taking a break in the belfry to wipe his forehead and examine the 4 bells more closely. None of them were named. That ceremony was reserved for the largest of the towers, like Big Ben. On the next level, Danny leaned the package against the stair railing, watching the hypnotizing effect of the clockwork's movement. It had been a while since the gears were cleaned. Someone would have to come back and do that. The maintenance crew in Enfield was not allowed to touch the clock pieces, only clean and take care of the tower on a basic level, and report anything unusual to the headquarters in London, like missing numerals and hands. Fear beat against Danny's ribcage. Sweat dampened his collar. Don't panic, he told himself. Don't panic. Don't panic. But he couldn't stop thinking about something happening to this tower. The incident at Share had been investigated and Danny had been questioned. Though the authorities had found evidence of a bomb, no one could determine the reason behind the attack. Some thought it was terrorism. Some thought it was a misguided prank. An exploding mechanism was one of the rarer dangers mechanics faced. Still, that moment hovered over him, in his sleep and in the back of his mind. A ghost of terror. Now clock parts were disappearing from this tower. I don't even know if it's connected, he reminded himself. A cog the size of a dinner plate circled in the middle of the clockwork. The central cog was the most important component of the whole tower. Without it, the rest of the clock would refuse to run, and time would stop until the cog was replaced. The central cog of the Share Tower had sliced Danny's chin open, turning his white shirt crimson. He could still feel the burn of it, the violent kiss of hot powder against his skin, the jarring skips of time like an arrhythmic heartbeat. Cuts along his body had seeped blood onto the gouged floor created by the skidding of smoking gears, and all the banging, screeching, screaming. Stop it, he whispered, closing his eyes tight. He held himself in busy silence, a stillness that wasn't still, as there was movement in the tower all around him. Danny opened his eyes and gazed balefully at the central cog. He laid his fingers on the gear and left trails in the dust as it turned, like ripples in a pond. What are you doing? Danny jerked back and nearly tripped over the package. The blonde apprentice stood on the staircase, frowning down on him. How many times had a mentor told him not to touch the central cog, or that his fingers would be crushed if he played with the gears? I was just checking it, Danny said, to make sure it's there. You're such an idiot. Brandon's amber eyes flashed, not even glancing at the cog. It's there. Ah, you're right, it is. Good. Danny lifted the package to his shoulder, attempting to hide his burning face. You like to arrive early, don't you? He received no answer. Let's get started. When they reached the clock room, Brandon's frown dissolved into his earlier expression of curiosity. Danny noticed that the apprentice wore the same outfit as last time, tight trousers and a baggy shirt. His clavicle peeked out from underneath his collar. Danny swallowed. You know, he started, then lost his nerve, unbuttoning his coat instead. When he looked back up, the apprentice was staring at him. You need to wear different clothes for this sort of work. Brandon tilted his head to one side, then looked Danny up and down with a small smile. It was a thorough assessment that Danny felt his earlier blush. It was such a thorough assessment that Danny felt his earlier blush return like a wave of heat. Should I dress like you? Yes, I suppose. Danny typically wore a brown or black work vest, the silver chain of his timepiece hanging from a small pocket. His tall boots were worn, but most of the decorative but copper gearwork near the heels remained intact. The apprentice continued to smile. Danny had no clue what was so funny, but he wanted to change the subject as soon as possible. He shifted on his feet and outlined the plan to install the minute hand. Brandon wouldn't have much to do beyond serving as an extra pair of hands and to observe. Brandon's light eyes flitted around Danny's face as he talked, sometimes glancing down at the chain of his timepiece or the still-wrapped minute hand. Danny noticed the apprentice was as tall as he was, his waist slim under the large shirt, his body made of wiry sinew like a wound mainspring. Brandon had a nice face, almost too nice. It was lean and smooth, and Danny wondered if he ever had to shave. He suddenly had the absurd urge to touch the boy's jaw. Would that be strange? I'm sorry, that's cute. This is just cute. Come on. It's cute. His eyes trailed lower, and he barely stopped himself from gasping. The apprentice's left hand was deformed. It curled in on itself, shrunken within its baggy sleeve. How did I not see that before? Danny thought, furiously trying to recall their first meeting. Perhaps he'd been too preoccupied, but to not even notice. Danny's ears burned with silence, and he realized he had stopped talking. The apprentice watched him warily. Danny cleared his throat. Right. Let's begin. He couldn't mention it now. They again lowered the scaffolding down the clock face into the bitter cold. Without his coat, Danny was shivering in no time. Brandon didn't seem affected. But it wasn't just the cold that made Danny shiver. The height blurred its vision, and he triple-checked that the cables were secure. He remembered the easy way Brandon had scaled the clock face compared to the difficulty he'd had locating the right tools. How many jobs have you been on? Danny asked as they ran down cables. The apprentice looked up as if the sky held the answer. Just one. His hand slipped on the rope. You mean that was your first job? Brandon nodded. Danny cursed himself. He wished he'd handled the situation better, but it was much too late now. Hold on, Danny said. Apprentices usually start at 12 or 13. Aren't you a bit old to be starting on assignments? Brandon looked Danny up and down. Aren't you a bit young to be a mechanic? Danny tried not to clench his jaw. Maybe this boy wasn't so different from the others after all. Is that what you think? No, I've only ever seen older mechanics. Apprentices can become mechanics by 17 if they know what they're doing. Well, Brandon said, you certainly know what you're doing. Danny waited for the sarcasm to register, but it never did. He felt a curious lightness, momentarily driving away the pang of the damaged tower. Danny ducked his head and muttered a sheepish thanks. He watched Brandon as they worked. He wasn't using his left hand much. How had he held up the Roman numeral last time? Danny tried to remember and found that he couldn't. Are you ready? Brandon asked, putting on his upscaling belt. Sure. Danny couldn't have sounded less certain if he'd tried. Biting his lip, he peered down at the scaffolding. Brandon glanced at him out of the corner of his eye. You look like you know interesting stories, Brandon said. Do you? Do I know stories? Make-believe ones, you mean? I think everyone knows at least one story. Brandon gave him a sly smile. Tell me your one story, then. It was a strange request, but Danny racked his brain anyway, tiptoeing away from the cruder stories that Kathy knew by heart, rifling through his childhood memories. He recalled the fairy tales his mother would read him from a green leather-bound book they still kept somewhere in the house. He snatched the first one that came to mind. Have you heard of the story of Rapunzel? Brandon shook his head. I won't tell it very well, just to warn you. He cleared his throat. There once was a witch who lived in a tower. As they scaled down the clock face, Danny told the story of Dame Gothel, who kept the girl Rapunzel locked in a tower until her hair had grown amazingly long. Then a prince heard her singing and saw the way Rapunzel pulled the witch up with her hair. Thinking to try the same, he called for Rapunzel to lower her hair. And when she pulled him up and they met, they fell in love, and he came again and again to see her. He asked her to marry him, and they escaped the tower and were married in his kingdom. Brandon listened quietly the whole time. Danny realized they were already on the scaffolding, the minute hand resting heavily at their feet. What about the witch? Brandon asked. Danny had asked the same question when he was young. As his mother closed the book, she had paused to think for a moment. The witch never bothered them again, she'd said, brushing back his hair to kiss his forehead. Rapunzel and the prince were careful, and they were together. From there on out, the world was theirs. But Danny had gone back to read the ending for himself. Remembering it now, he took a deep breath. Rapunzel accidentally mentioned the prince, and the witch was furious, so she cut off all of Rapunzel's hair and cast her away. When the prince came up, the witch used Rapunzel's hair to hoist him up. Then she dropped him onto a bed of thorns, blinding him. The apprentice barely blinked, so Danny continued. The prince wandered for days until he heard Rapunzel singing. He followed the sound, and when they were reunited, she was so happy that she wept, and her tears healed his blindness. How that happened, I couldn't tell you. It's a fairy tale. All sorts of strange things happen in fairy tales. I see. Brandon gazed solemnly at the clock face, where the new Roman numeral 2 had been installed. I'm glad they were together, at least. Although I feel bad for the witch. What? Why? She must have acted that way for a reason. She didn't hate Rapunzel, or else she would have done something worse to her. Maybe she loved her. Maybe she felt betrayed. Rapunzel and the prince had a happy ending, but she didn't. She's the villain. She's not supposed to have a happy ending. I know. Brandon's eyes were unfocused. It just makes me wonder, if she'd done something different, she could have had a happy ending too. Danny stared at him until a blast of wind slapped him back into the present. Shivering, he reached for the minute hand. Can you hold on to this end here? Together they aligned the end of the clock to the cannon position, Danny being careful to take the most of the weight. He screwed in the industrial bolts, checking the ease of the movement. All the while he explained what he was doing and why. Brandon listened as rapidly as he had listened to the story. When Danny fastened the hand, he closed his eyes and tried to grasp the time fibers that flowed around the clock. They weren't frayed as they had been when the numeral was missing, but they were scattered. He gathered as many as he could, pulling them in tight. His fingers twitched as if he were knitting. Finally, with the 12 main fibers drawn together, Danny screwed in the last bolt. Stepping back, they watched as the longer minute hand slowly traveled around the clock's face until it stopped close to the 6th position. Just about 12:30. The pain in Danny's chest vanished. People from the market had come over to watch, and just as they had the last time, they cheered. The corners of Danny's lips had turned up. There was still the matter of the old minute hand, which had been taken back to the office for analysis. He had half a mind to snoop around the town some more, perhaps take a look at the ironworker's forge. Maybe he really did read too many detective novels. But he couldn't deny that the incident was suspicious, and after what happened in Sheer, he felt justified in his caution. Do you have a theory, he asked Brandon, about the missing tower parts? The apprentice hesitated. Danny took his silence as a no. This isn't normal. There has to be some reason why it's happening. At least now, with a second assignment under his belt, he would hopefully be closer to getting the assignment. As Danny gathered his tools, Brandon studied the clock face, an unreadable expression on his own. You mentioned your father last time, Brandon said. What happened to him? Danny couldn't tell what to be more surprised by, that the apprentice didn't already know, or that he'd asked. Everyone knew what happened to Christopher Hart. But there was something annoyingly sincere about Brandon's gaze as he took in Danny's reaction. That's not the sort of story you want to hear. It's a sad one. I like sad stories too. Danny's anger flared like wind through a flame. But he quashed it and gestured to the cable on either side of the scaffolding. Let's get inside. After they dragged the scaffolding back into the tower, Danny smoothed down his runaway hair. He glanced several times at his apprentice, who was taking in view of the still bustling marketplace. He disappeared 3 years ago. Brandon turned, surprised. He lifted a hand like he would touch Danny's arm in sympathy. Danny turned away before he could. He wasn't sure what would happen if Brandon touched him now. How? Danny brushed the dust from his trousers. Not disappeared, exactly. He was a mechanic, like me. One of the best. Worked on Big Ben all the time. Some of his favorite childhood memories were when his father and Matthias told him about the massive clockwork inside Big Ben and the 4 gleaming faces at the very top staring out at all of London. He started training me when I was young. We took apart clocks and timepieces and read books about clock towers around the world. Mum had hopes of sending me to Cambridge or Oxford, but I refused. I wanted to be like Dad. I wanted to be a clock mechanic. He smiled as a memory unfurled within him, a memory of his father and him laughing when a spring became lost within his mother's curly hair. But as he continued, the smile died. We saved up to go on holiday to France, since Mum's always wanted to go. But something happened to happened to a tower in Malden. They needed someone to look into it. Danny swallowed. His throat felt tight, like the hand of the past gently squeezed it. My father volunteered. Mum wouldn't leave for our holiday without him, so we were stuck at home. He went to Malden and didn't send any word back to us. The next day, we heard the town was stopped. Brandon cocked his head to one side. Stopped? Lord, you don't know anything. When the clock stops working altogether, until it's fixed, the town stops, and the people inside are trapped. Time can't move forward. No seasons pass. Days don't transition to night. People don't age. And no one can speak to the ones trapped inside, not even through a telephone. They're all just stuck there, caught in an endless loop. Danny again recalled the horrifying moment in Sheer where the clockwork exploded. If he hadn't fixed the clock in time, he would have suffered the same fate as his father. A voice in his mind whispered that maybe he should have. We don't know why the town stopped, or how the clock can be fixed. We don't know anything. All we can do is wait and see if there's any change. Danny sat on the staircase leading to the platform and rested his arms on his knees. Mum keeps waiting for him to walk through the door, but I know he won't. Once the town is stopped until the clock is fixed. Everyone leaves in the end. The apprentice settled down next to Danny, his eyebrows furrowed. I'm sorry. You're right. That is a sad story. You asked to hear it, Danny reminded him, cross. He wasn't even sure why he had bothered to tell him. But if Brandon didn't hear it from him, some other mechanic or apprentice would have been all too pleased to trade gossip. There was something about the apprentice that made Danny feel his words would not be judged, that it was safe to tell his story here. Are you sure nothing can be done? Brandon asked. Well, there is one thing. They're building a new clock tower just outside of Malden. It's almost complete, but the clockwork needs to be forged and installed. The lead thinks that if this tower creates a new area of time, it'll cross into Malden's time zone and free the town. Some of the mechanics say it won't work. Others don't want the tower built at all. He rubbed his eyes, but it has to work. It has to. If they can't find a way, I will. I have to see Dad again. I have to tell him I'm sorry. Brandon mulled over the story. I think you'll see your father again. Others would speak such platitudes with caution, knowing in the back of their minds that it was possible Danny would never be reunited with his father. The words were cardboard condolences, spoken over and over in a bland, frustrating mantra. Keep faith. It'll be all right. Be strong, Danny. He looked at the apprentice and saw no pity in his eyes, just concern. We'll see, he said, standing. He stretched his arms above his head and heard his shoulder pop. What do you think? Drinks to celebrate the repair? Brandon's head shot up. Drinks? Danny glanced outside. I guess it's a little early. Still, why not? The apprentice hesitated, then shook his head, his eyes averted. No, thank you. Danny lingered, hoping Brandon would change his mind. When it became clear he was on his own, he reached for his coat. He heard his name and turned around. Brandon sat there, hands on his knees. Danny had to look twice. His left hand was now identical to the right, unmarred, whole. Then what the hell had he seen? A trick of the light? What is it? Danny asked when Brandon remained silent, heart beating a little faster. He willed him to change his mind, to jump up and say that drinks were a good idea after all, to explain his damned hand. The apprentice chewed his lips and shook his head again. Disappointed, Danny slung his bag over his shoulder. By then, he started down the stairs, feeling Brandon's eyes on his back. It wasn't until he reached the bottom that he realized something. He had been too busy reciting the story of Rapunzel to focus on his fear of the scaffolding, or his fear of the clock. Okay, my voice needs a serious break right now. My throat feels so dry. I need a break for a second. Okay. My throat is not feeling great right now. I'm not gonna lie, my throat is definitely not feeling best. Okay. I think I'll do one more chapter and then I'm gonna stop because my throat really is starting to hurt. But one more chapter shouldn't kill me. Chapter 5. Danny gripped the steering wheel so tightly his hands looked bloodless. Every exhaltation rattled from his chest. "Calm down," he whispered. "It won't happen again." He was parked outside of Cher. He'd suffered nightmare after nightmare about this place. Now he was back. The first time since the incident. He realized what a horrible, stupid, idiotic idea this was. No one had given him an assignment. No one had forced him to come. He was here on his own because he had questions. Swallowing painfully, Danny untangled himself from the steering wheel and walked into the village. The roads too narrow for his auto. The buildings were old, but in a way his mother would call charming. Ivy grew up the sides of the houses, and the steeple of the church roof was wet after the recent rainfall. Children laughed nearby, playing a game with hoops. He wanted to run. He wanted to stop. He stopped in front of a statue and leaned against it. The stone was cold and made him shiver, but its solidness was reassuring. He focused on breathing as he stared at the ground, then at the statue. After a moment, he realized it was a shrine. It was common to see relics of the Gaian gods following it in small towns and villages. Some probably still held fast to the old religion, but Danny had yet to meet anyone who actively prayed to the lost gods. Some of the clock mechanics even rolled their eyes at the mention of Ateus. Danny himself wasn't sure if they had ever existed, despite his father's stories. Sometimes a story was simply a way to put the extraordinary into perspective, to embellish a truth so much that it became nothing but fabrication. The goddess he was using as a prop was Terra of the earth. Of course, Cher was surrounded by farmland. Farmers would sacrifice livestock as offerings to Terra in ancient times. Danny certainly hoped that practice had died out. Terra sat cross-legged, her weather-worn hands pressed to the ground. Her face had long since eroded, but it was tilted up as if receiving strength from the sun. Her long hair fanned over her shoulders. Stone strands chipped and pockmarked. Ivy snaked around one of Terra's arms. Danny patted her shoulder in an awkward apology and stepped away from the shrine. He turned toward the village square where the clock tower stood in the center, gray stone stretching up to the white face. The ivy had even found its way out here. The whole village choked with it. Creeping up the tower, it looked more like a grave marker than a clock. The bomb had done the most damage inside, blasting apart the clockwork and breaking wooden beams. Nothing permanent, nothing a few replacement parts and some carpentry couldn't fix. The central cog, the most important of all, had remained intact. If it hadn't, he would never have made it out. Danny didn't trust himself to draw any nearer, as if getting too close would make the clockwork explode all over again. Instead, he forced himself to approach the people around the square. Luckily, no one recognized him. A woman bounced a baby on her lap as Danny asked about the tower. "Missing parts?" she said. "No, I don't think so." You didn't see anything strange beforehand? A lost numeral, perhaps, or something wrong with the hands? Not that I recall. He asked a few others, but they all said the same thing. Everything had been running smoothly until the bomb went off. No one could remember seeing a suspicious person, not even when Danny described the Enfield ironworker. There was a mechanic who came before the bombing, a man with long sideburns, and said, a big man with a strange walk. Danny recognized the description of Tom Hawthorne, one of the older mechanics. He had worked on the Shear Tower a week before Danny, and had been the first suspect. After an inquiry, the authorities had declared him innocent. The clock struck 3. The pealing of the bells shook Danny's heart. He hurried back to his auto, breaths fast and shallow. Sitting in the driver's seat, he closed his eyes, sweat rolled down his temples. He swore he heard the clock ticking even from here. I was in an accident. I got out. I'm safe now. 20 minutes passed before he could drive home. Danny sat his mug down with a loud sigh. That good, is it? Matthias asked, smiling. Danny sloshed the golden liquid, careful not to spill any. The color inanely reminded him of Brandon's eyes. You taught me how to drink, remember? I did, didn't I? Matthias laughed. Shame on me, then. What'll I say to your poor mother? That her son is now a drunkard. Danny drained his mug and banged it on the table. The unimpressed barmaid snatched it up. The only thing preventing Danny from being thrown out was that he was sitting with Matthias, arguably the pub's most frequent patron. Matthias had set down his own mug, his first of the night, and barely half drunk. Danny, I know something's the matter. The truth, then? Matthias nodded, so Danny leaned forward in a conspiratorial manner. I'm actually Queen Victoria. Fooled you, didn't I? He snickered, but when a muscle in Matthias's jaw feathered, Danny silenced himself. It's nothing much, he mumbled to his hands, which were curled on the sticky tabletop. Just thinking about Dad. The barmaid came and left. The newly filled mug of beer sat within easy reach, but Danny didn't touch it. Been 3 years, Matthias said, taking a sip of his own pint. I can hardly believe it. He shook his head slowly, blue eyes darkening. I suppose you haven't heard anything more about the new tower? Danny asked. It isn't coming along the way the mechanics want it to. They say there's been something off about it. It doesn't help that the protesters are being catchy, demonstrating all around the construction site. Danny frowned. I want to help, but the lead won't let me. He doesn't believe I'm recovered. When Danny had approached him after installing the minute hand, he'd been rewarded with the same string of words. Patient, wait, sorry. Matthias kept his hands clutched around his mug, gaze fixed on the murky drink. He took a breath as if to speak, then let it out again. I know, Danny said, finally collecting his mug. Don't despair. It'll come to rights, Danny. You're being too pessimistic, Danny. Well, Danny knows the truth, and he's not an idiot. Matthias put a strong hand on his arm. It's good to be realistic. No false expectations, but don't give up hope. Danny nodded, and the hand slipped away. He took a sip, but found he had no desire for the drink anymore. Matthias knew all about grief. Danny remembered when his father had sat him down and explained that he should never ask Matthias about his late wife, Alice. She had died young, just 4 years after their wedding, leaving Matthias to grieve for 20 more. Christopher had told his friend to take a new bride, but Matthias had stubbornly refused. Then Matthias had been assigned to Malden's clock tower just over 3 years ago. People believed that while he was there, Matthias had fallen for a woman and lost focus of the job he was sent there to do. While distracted, he had done something irreparable to the clock, something grave enough to be fired as mechanic and exiled from Malden. Although nobody could say what it was, a private meeting had occurred between Matthias and the lead, where Matthias had entered the office as a mechanic and left only as a teacher. That was the story everyone knew. The one Matthias told went a little differently. In his version, Matthias claimed to have met the tower's clock spirit. He told the story the same way he told all his stories, in that slightly lilting voice, his eyes dark and turned to something distant. Danny might as well have been a child again, sitting at his side with the man's arm across his shoulder. She was lovely, Matthias would say, and she could feel time in a way no one else could, not even me. She was time. Danny had grown up with the myth of clock spirits. Some claimed that each clock's power over time manifested itself into a spirit that guarded the tower and the delicate clockwork within. Others said that it was leftover power from Matthias that clung to the towers when the god died. That's what its father would believed. Danny wanted to believe it too, but never could. As much as he devoured stories, he always held a kernel of doubt in his pocket. Still, superstitions were hard to snuff out. No one liked to be reminded of the mechanics in Glasgow who had fallen in love with his tower. No one liked to be reminded of the mechanic in Glasgow who had fallen so in love with his tower that time reversed every time the sun set, making the day start over and over again in an endless loop. Or the mechanic in Paris who had caused a citywide disaster when time crawled almost to a stop within a 1-mile radius from the tower where she had secretly been staying. It wasn't an official rule in any handbook, but it didn't need to be. Everyone knew that forming an emotional attachment to a clock was forbidden. Matthias had fallen in love, he said. The weak muscle of his heart had grown strong again, but as he tried to keep this supposed clock spirit affair a secret, something within the tower had broken. He had been unable to repair it, and time skittered wildly. Danny's father had been sent to Malden to fix things. Days later, the town stopped. It was just another of Matthew's stories, a fabrication built layer upon layer until the truth was so buried that Danny couldn't see it. There was no witch in the Baialoesa forest. There were no man-eating dragons in China. There were no clock spirits. Danny understood that Matthias wanted to protect himself from his mistake, that his shame could momentarily be disguised with wonder. So Danny let him tell his stories. He pretended to believe. But he knew better. It didn't matter how many stories you told if you were still at fault in the end. Here, Danny said, pushing the mug toward Matthias. I think I'm finished. Disappointment increased Matthias' eyes, or perhaps it was guilt. He often looked that way, even though Danny had forgiven him a long time ago. Heading home? Give your mother a kiss for me. Danny knew she wouldn't accept a kiss from her own son, let alone him. He was about to pay when Matthias waved his hand away. Go on. Get some rest. I'll take care of it. And Danny, the next time you have these thoughts, don't hesitate to ring me. I'll always be on the other end of the line. Danny managed a small smile. I know. The pub was not far from home. Kennington was loud with the sounds of autos, carriages, horses, and the cries of costermongers selling matches and rat poison. He kicked an empty tin toward the street. It would be picked up by morning by the cleaning crew, a new development since the sanitation reform had kicked in. A young crossing sweeper with a broom in his hand shot Danny a nasty glare. Some thought the city was chaotic, yet Danny loved it. The cobbled roads, the tall buildings, the history, the technology. London was the thriving pulse of the civilized world. He weaved through the ladies with spotless white gloves and the grimy chimney sweeps, dropping soot wherever they went. Steam and smoke rose from chimneys and engines, forming a gray cloud that loomed over them all. As he walked through the front door, Danny saw his mother on the telephone. She stood hunched over the holder, the chartreuse-colored receiver clutched in one hand. Danny's heart stuttered. His mother had been in this exact position when they'd received the call about his father. This was the position of the world ending. But then he realized she was simply writing something on the pad beside the telephone. Yes, of course. All right. Thank you very much. She hung the receiver back on its holder and ripped the paper from the pad. Lila turned and jumped at the sight of him. Danny! When on earth did you get here? Just now. Who were you speaking to? Who? She pointed uselessly at the telephone. Oh, that was nothing. Nora called me to tell me about a new boutique in Piccadilly I might like. Lila peered up at her son, the paper she clutched in her small hands, as if waiting to be dismissed or told that her lie was good enough. Danny was too tired and too tipsy to argue. He shrugged and shucked off his coat. She disappeared into the kitchen, and he followed slowly behind. A container of milk had been forgotten on the table. "Mum, put this in the cold box for Christ's sake." "Don't use that language," she snapped, distracted as she cut up carrots on the counter. She had thrown on a stained apron, and her eyebrows were knotted in concentration, as if she were performing surgery, not crookedly mincing root vegetables. Something had filled her with an almost manic energy. "Which reminds me, you should come to church this Sunday. An out-of-town bishop's coming to give a lecture." She hardly ever spoke to him this much. She was definitely in a good mood. Danny hid his face as he returned the milk to the cold box. "I'll see if I'm free." "You smell like the pub," she murmured. "I think church will do you some good." "Church won't earn us money or get Dad back." Her mother sighed, but when she said nothing further, he escaped upstairs to his room. As it so happened, he was busy Sunday after all. During a breakfast of crumbs he'd found at the bottom of the bread box, his mother hadn't bought a new loaf. The telephone in the hall rang. "Hello?" "Ah, Daniel." The lead mechanic's voice came through tinny and crackled. Danny automatically stood straighter, although the man couldn't see him. "Yes, sir?" "Good, I've caught you in time. There seems to be another issue with the tower you've been fixing this week. The one in Enfield." "Again?" His mother, coming down the stairs, dressed for church, threw him a startled look. "Haven't they caught the person doing this? We're not sure if it's a vandal or the clock's simply falling apart. The Enfield maintenance crew hasn't reported anything suspicious." Danny imagined the ironworker in the dead of night tiptoeing away from the tower with a sinister chuckle. "What's wrong with it this time? There appears to be a crack in the face. We think it was caused by the minute hand's removal. Nothing substantial. The time's not skewed much. It's just a nuisance. Don't want it disturbing the structure. You understand?" Danny gazed heavenward, wondering if he should go to church after all. "I'll drive out as soon as I can." "Good show. I'll ring up the apprentice." Danny hung up the receiver and stared at the telephone, the bottom of his stomach feeling strange as he thought about the blonde boy. Or maybe that was hunger. Danny enjoyed his work, or at least he used to. Most mechanics were passionate about their field of expertise, but he had never heard of a clock having this many problems in such a short amount of time. Usually his jobs were spaced out to once a week, perhaps once a month in lean times. Thrice in 1 week was virtually unheard of, especially 3 times for one small clock tower. Something was off. Sabotage? A bad attempt at a practical joke? Whatever the reason behind these incidents, Danny was getting more and more frustrated and scared. Okay. The auto sputtered and rumbled as he drove into Enfield. Some people waved while others called hellos. Danny was so used to the... I know this word, my brain just doesn't want to remember how to say it. One sec. I need to check something. When did this chapter end? 93. Dang, there's quite a bit left to this chapter. I probably shouldn't have started this. Okay. Danny was so used to the anonymity of London that it hadn't crossed his mind that the townspeople would know him by sight now. He waved back, perturbed, but didn't stop to chat. An attractive young man smiled at him, and Danny slowed for a moment, then forced himself onward with a scolding shake of his head. A crack marred the clock face between the numbers 3 and 4. Danny parked the auto across the street and eyed the damage for a moment. It would take some time to fix a crack that big. The back of his skull pulsed with a sudden pain as he rested his forehead on the steering wheel. He had to prove himself. No more panicking. Sorry, I'm distracted. Curiously, there was another auto parked near his own. Danny gave it a confused glance before heading inside the tower. He reached the familiar clock room and set his bag down with a sigh. Here we go again. He turned and unbuttoned his coat. There's something seriously wrong with this ruddy old... Who the hell are you? The boy standing in the clock room blinked at him. I'm the apprentice, Brandon Summers. Danny stared at him, unaware his jaw had dropped until until he closed it with a click of his teeth. The boy was decidedly not the apprentice he had worked with before. This one had dark skin with a snub nose and hooded brown eyes. His black hair clipped short. He wore a white cravat with his gray vest and trousers. You're not the... I've never seen you before. Can't figure you would have. The boy, also Brandon, said with a hint of impatience. Knew Brandon was younger, though a couple of inches taller than Danny and broader in the shoulder. I was sick. Didn't you get my note? Would have called, but our telephone is faulty. But the office... Was I supposed to tell the office too? Danny stood, marinating in his own disbelief. Something caught his eye, and he looked over the apprentice's shoulder. Standing just behind New Brandon was the blonde apprentice. He grinned when Danny spotted him. He had a scar on his left cheek, just like the crack on the clock face. Something the matter? New Brandon asked. Danny shook himself and looked again, but the boy had disappeared. It can't be, he whispered. His veins throbbed with the force of his heartbeat. What are you going on about? Danny struggled to remember how words worked. He kept staring over New Brandon's shoulder. But when the apprentice turned around, there was nothing to see. Sorry, Danny croaked. Not good. He probably looked like a lunatic. Danny forced a laugh. Sorry, I just had a thought, but it's gone now. What'd you say your name was? Brandon? Summers, the boy finished. The name clipped around his frown. They should have told you. I see, Brandon Summers. The blonde boy had said his name was Brandon Summers. Danny couldn't recall half the names of his past apprentices, but he had remembered that one. Danny felt as if his eyes were on him, and in the space between his shoulder blades tightened. He heard the faint echo of laughter in the whirring clock gears. You all right? New Brandon asked. You want a lie down or... No, I'm fine. Let's get to work. They settled in to discuss the plan of action. Danny could barely concentrate, and his explanation was filled with pauses. He turned to his tools and quickly looked around. There he was, standing so that New Brandon couldn't see him, wearing his white billowy shirt and tight trousers. The boy met Danny's eyes and smiled, his mouth a mischievous curl. In a blink, he was gone again. Losing my mind, Danny muttered. Losing my damn mind. Thankfully, the repair could be done without having to use the scaffolding. The clock room allowed them access to the clock face, gleaming yellow and white as the sun slanted through. The floorboards had been stripped of the color after decades of sun exposure. The light turned the dust motes floating in the air into specks of gold. Danny and New Brandon, real Brandon, each donned goggles before preparing the sharp-smelling cleaning solution. They wiped the length of the fissure with it, making sure there were no small pieces of glass residue, and waiting for the surface to dry. Then Danny sealed the crack with strong resin, which was specially formulated to mimic the glass. He felt the strange boy's gaze the entire time, resting like a hand upon his back. Once they'd sanded the resin and chipped the extra away, Danny told the apprentice to watch as he set his hands upon the crack. He closed his eyes and felt the fibers there, intact but with a line through them that threatened their delicate system. Danny erased it until there was only the thinnest hairbreadth remaining. He sealed the rest of the gap by taking tiny amounts of each thread, pinching them together until time rolled like an air current through the fibers. He opened his eyes and saw the crack was healed. The apprentice whistled appreciatively as Danny stepped back. Nice work, mechanic. Thank you. Would you help me clean up? With nothing left for him to do, real Brandon prepared to leave. He hesitated by the stairs. You won't tell the office about the mix-up, will you? About them sending payment for the other jobs? At Danny's silence, Brandon turned fully toward him. I wouldn't normally ask, but my family, I won't say anything. It's just that I've got 5 siblings. Real Brandon was in a rush. They need new clothes, and don't worry, I won't mention it. The apprentice had taken something out of his pocket. A tiger's eye marvel, a sphere of dark amber with a black slit running down the middle. He fiddled with it, but not nervously as Danny tended to fiddle with his timepiece. Rather, he rolled the marble around in his fingers, as though he was in the practice of doing it often. You sure, mate? Yes, I'm sure. You're free to go. He watched as the apprentice galloped down the stairs, eager to be away before Danny changed his mind. Danny sat down on the box near the clock face and listened to the ticking at his back. He took out his timepiece and checked the time, pocketed it, forgot the time, and checked again. When he looked up, the blond boy was standing before him. Danny swallowed. He looked like an average boy Danny's age, but there was something about him. Something that had been there from the start. That was more than average. Like the evasive unknown between the time fibers Danny reached for in the darkness. It couldn't be true. He didn't want it to be true, but the threads of the story kept unraveling, wanting him to find the truth hidden inside. The question emerged before he could stop himself. You're the clock spirit, aren't you? The boy didn't respond, but smiled with a glimmer in his amber eyes. No, that can't be right. That's not... Danny stared back at him, at a loss. The boy stared back. Possible. Anything is possible, his father had said. God, Danny breathed. When you've never seen one, do you really live here? You're actually the clock spirit cocked his head to one side. The scar on his cheek had gone, sealed like the crack on the face. Silly question. Of course you are. Danny was trying to remain calm, but every second only heightened his amazement. Why didn't you tell me? You thought I was your apprentice. I wanted to help. Yes, but you weren't, and I looked like an idiot. Danny groaned and rested his forehead on his palms. The spirit sat on the box beside him. I should have told you earlier. I'm sorry. Danny dropped his hands and looked up. This close, the spirit's eyes were mesmerizing, almost as striking as the glint of the opal glass behind them. What's your real name? Danny whispered. Colton. Of course, the name of the tower. Another silly question. God, I'm thick. He rubbed his eyes. Why didn't you show yourself to Brandon? The real Brandon. Colton linked his hands together between his knees. I've never revealed myself to anyone. And yet here you are, with me. Why? The spirit tipped his head so that some of his bright hair fell forward. I don't know. You don't know? When the spirit only shrugged, Danny rose and began to pace around the room. You show yourself to me, help me repair you, and you don't show yourself to anyone else? You speak to me, and yet you... Hang on. Danny stopped. His excitement tripled. Why do you keep falling apart? Who's doing this to you? If anyone knows, it's you. Colton looked away. Danny knelt before him, but the spirit wouldn't meet his eyes. It's all right. You can tell me. I'm a mechanic. It's my job to know if someone's tampering with your tower. It's not as if you're the one doing it. No response. Danny stared at him, heartbeat quickening. Did you do this to yourself? And Colton didn't answer. Danny's frustration boiled into anger. What's the matter with you? Why would you do that? The spirit disappeared, just vanished. Danny gasped and fell on his backside. Colton winked back into existence a few feet away. No one comes here, he said, eyes blazing. No one cares about this place. The cleaners come and faff about and leave me dirtier than before. I haven't had a real mechanic set foot in here in a year. Danny ran a hand over the front of his waistcoat, speechless. Eventually he murmured, You shouldn't do that to yourself. It harms you and the town. Colton lowered his gaze. The numeral was resting and the minute hand was slowing. I had to do something. They stayed like that, motionless, for a full minute. Then Danny stood up carefully, worried that the spirit would disappear again at any moment. Something had changed between them, and it made his frantic mind slow. He should have been angry. He should have told Colton what a mess he'd made. But he couldn't, because he understood. Coming nearer, Danny raised his hand. Would it be all right to touch you? Colton didn't move at first. Then he took a step forward and held out a thin, bronze-colored hand. Danny cupped it with his bigger, paler hand, his fingers first skimming the inside of Colton's palm before their hands clasped. Danny held back another gasp. A peculiar ripple traveled up his spine, and the hairs on his body stood on end. It was much like touching the time fibers, brushing a finger across them to feel the yawning of time open and swallow him whole. He was scattered across the cosmos and deep within the earth, within himself and outside of himself. A minuscule star in the infinite sky, a tiny speck of life in the flow of time. He came back to himself a few seconds, hours later, breathless. Their hands were still clasped, a seam of gold and silver. How could something with such a gentle touch melt an iron numeral or bend a minute hand? The spirit was much stronger than he appeared. A dangerous thrill shot up Danny's body. He tried to imagine being stuck in this tower for years without end, to have no other option than to pretend he was falling apart to get attention. Danny tugged the spirit forward. Come with me. They walked down a level to the clockwork. Danny heard the swinging of the pendulum below. The heavy weight like a beating heart under their feet. Danny tried to feel for Colton's pulse, but the hand within his own was still. The pendulum was not the heart of the clock, the lungs, perhaps, every swing a breath propelling life forward, but the heart was something else. The lines made by his fingers were still on the central cog, creating channels in the dust. Danny touched it. These gears need cleaning. You can't trust a maintenance crew to do that. Why don't I come back and do it myself? Colton narrowed his eyes. You would do that? I won't be paid for it, but I'd like to. I can tell it's been a while, and if the dust keeps gathering, it'll muck everything up. Won't you get in trouble? A mechanic was never supposed to accept a job if it didn't come from the lead himself. But in this instance, what could Danny say? He couldn't tell the lead the real reason why the clock was falling apart. He'd look mad. No, I won't get in trouble. Colton's face brightened, shining like the clock face above them. He followed the trail Danny's eyes had made across the clockwork a moment earlier. Can I tell you a secret? What's that? I'm off by about 4 minutes. Danny blinked, then smiled. Colton sounded like a boy who just admitted to trampling his mother's prized flowers. Don't worry, I'll fix that too. This chapter is almost over. My throat is seriously feeling dead. Okay. He knelt in front of the clockwork, eyeing it with appreciation, the complex structure forged from cleverness and creativity and necessity. His tools were laid out beside him, from the soft bristled brush to the screwdriver he'd need for cleaning and disassembly. Although Danny couldn't stop the flutter of anxiety from being so close to the mechanism, he had to admire it for what it was. After the incident with his father, Danny had retreated from society. He didn't want to mince words and force smiles with the stone that sat within him wedged while the stone that sat within him wedged itself deeper, cutting and bleeding him dry. Because of his distance, he had developed a reputation for being odd. People gave him sidelong looks and whispered as soon as they thought he was out of earshot. Out in the world, Danny didn't feel himself. There was nothing for him there. Here, he felt needed, valued. The tower was a sanctuary, all gold lines and hard curves, glinting glass, standing old and steady under the thrum of time. Colton stood at his shoulder as he looked on. Danny found the small components of the clockwork, the cogs that could be removed without interfering too much with the clock's running. Even if time paused, the townspeople probably wouldn't notice if Danny replaced the parts quickly enough. When he'd driven into Enfield that morning, he'd worried of what the townspeople might say, since there was no noticeable problem with the tower. But there was a wedding taking place at St. Andrew's Church today, distracting many of them. He wondered what would happen if time warped over the assembly, giving a new meaning to the term, forever hold your peace. Sorry. It was something he wanted to avoid. All apprentices were trained to recognize the signs of stopping, being enclosed by a solid gray barrier or time skipping repeatedly. One had to move fast to reverse the effects. A retired mechanic who'd once been trapped in a stopped town had explained to Danny's class that people could still move and speak to one another, but were unable to do much else. Items that were picked up returned to their original positions. A woman had run out of her door 13 times in a row, caught in a loop. All that training had gone out the window for Danny when the sheer clock blew up. Adrenaline and what Matthias had called his intuition had prevented disaster then. That and the strange other power he'd felt so briefly. Look at all this dust, Danny muttered, giving the gears a preliminary wipe with the cloth. How do they expect you to keep running under these conditions? I think they forget, Colton said, leaning down to inspect what Danny was doing. Forget? How could they? Colton shrugged. More like take you for granted. Don't worry, you're in good hands now. The spirit smiled, slow and full. I don't doubt it, Danny. The sound of his name set his heart off like a firework. He turned his head and realized how close their faces were, trying not to blush. Danny quickly turned back to the clockwork. A clock spirit. A clock spirit. He'd tried to get his head around the fact, but spent the night tossing and turning. Not out of fear, but fascination. They really did exist. They weren't just a myth, which meant that Matthias' story might be true. He had always humored Matthias, pretending to believe him, but now Danny couldn't help but look at him differently. Understand him differently. You could imagine the scene now, in a way he couldn't before. Matthias standing before the lead, being told that his relationship with the Malden clock was forbidden, disastrous, unacceptable, stripped of his title and his pride, knowing no one else would believe him. Danny removed the first small cog and used the brush to carefully clean its spokes. The weight of the spirit's eyes was still on him. He was certain Colton was just as fascinated with him as he was with Colton. Danny looked over his shoulder. You don't have to wait around on my account. Look in the bag there. Colton crouched and lifted the flap of the satchel with a thin finger. He dragged out a large book with a green cover. Fairy tales. Figured you might want to read them while I do this. Colton smiled wider and sat on the floor. The book opened to a random page on his lap. Danny returned to the clockwork. The pages turned at a quicker rate than he expected, so he glanced over to find the spirit examining the illustrations. The pictures are nice, but the stories are good too. I can't read. You can't? Well, of course you can't. You're a bloody clock. Here. He leaned over and flipped to the story of Rapunzel. Look at these. Look at those pictures. They're from the story I told you. Colton did as he was told. Since he seemed to be enjoying himself, Danny resumed his work. It proved to be a long, labor-intensive process, and he was sweating by the time he cleaned the larger cogs. Time would occasionally slow down around them, and he felt as if he dragged his limbs through the air turned to jam. But when he replaced the parts he cleaned, it returned to normal. He stopped to eat lunch and told Colton more stories. He read about Cinderella. The spirit enjoyed the part about the clock striking midnight and Sleeping Beauty. During the latter, Colton kept asking about the time dimensions used to make everyone in the kingdom sleep for 100 years. As Danny finished the last bit of his sandwich, he looked up and started. A brown mouse was perched on Colton's shoulder. Colton looked at where Danny was staring. Hello, you're probably hungry. The mouse's ears trembled. Is this normal? Danny asked, watching the mouse. Its whiskers twitched, nose sniffing the air. You being friends with the tower mice? No one else to talk to. Danny winced. Keeping his eyes on the mouse, he broke off a piece of bread and leaned forward. The mouse grabbed it with tiny paws and began nibbling it at once, spilling crumbs down Colton's shirt. I feel like I'm in my own fairy tale. Colton smiled. The larger gears couldn't be handled without assistance from at least 2 other people, so Danny reluctantly used the ladder to reach the higher ones and wipe them off as they moved. He attacked between the spokes with his brush, and dust and grit flew off, making him sneeze. Finally, Danny returned to the main structure of the clockwork. He watched the central cog for some time until he knelt to wipe it with an alcohol-soaked cloth. Streaks of grime peeled away, revealing a bright copper surface underneath. As he dusted off the spokes, he sensed Colton standing at his back. He was silent, but Danny felt his tension like a pulled bowstring. He would be rather nervous himself if someone were laying their hands upon his heart. No one's treated me this gently in a long time, the spirit said. Danny looked up at him. Colton's face was grave. The fairy tale is now reduced to nothing but a childish distraction. My father taught me to do it this way. The other mechanics haven't been gentle? Colton shook his head. I'm sorry. Not all mechanics are careful, I'm afraid. A few aren't even all that good. Just because someone's born to sense time doesn't mean that they have any skill with it. You're a good mechanic, Colton said. Their eyes met, and Danny fought to swallow. I want you to be my mechanic. Well, that's not really my choice to... His voice died away as the spirit leaned down and kissed him. Danny's eyes widened. His chest rioted. Blonde hair tickled his forehead, and he could see the curve of Colton's closed eyelids, so close to his own. The spirit's lips were surprisingly soft. It was difficult to remind himself that Colton wasn't really made of flesh, that he was only a manifestation. He felt real enough. The entire universe was flooding into his chest. Time hugged him, held him, and warned him of its strength beyond the gentle touch of months. Colton leaned back, and their lips separated with a small noise. Danny stared at him, out of breath, feverish. He was unsure what to say now. Thank you didn't seem like a proper response. Colton's eyes gleamed like sunshine on metal. Will you come back? Danny remained kneeling by the clock's turning heart, his own beating so hard he would be shocked if Colton couldn't hear it. The cogs seemed to listen and wait for his response. But Matthias' pained face flashed across his mind. He knew what happened to mechanics who got too close to the spirits. Danny refused to turn Enfield into another Malden. Yes, he lied, giving a little nod to convince him. Yes, I will. Okay. So yeah, that was a few chapters of Timekeeper. I'm just gonna go because my throat really, really hurts. But I'll probably be back again tomorrow. So yeah. Bye guys.